I remember the exact sound the wheelchair made when it hit the marble floor. That sharp, metallic clang echoed through my sister Vivian's 12,000 square foot estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, and for a split second, every single person in that sunlit dining room froze. The crystal stemware stopped clinking, the laughter died. Even the string quartet she'd hired for what she kept calling an intimate Christmas gathering, 43 people because Vivian Calloway Marsh has never once in her life understood the word intimate, went completely silent. My daughter Reese was 12 years old. She had juvenile onset multiple sclerosis. She had been in that wheelchair for 7 months, and every single day of those 7 months, I had watched her fight to believe that her body wasn't her enemy. I had sat on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning when the nerve pain kept her up, and I had told her, "You are so strong, baby. You are so unbelievably strong." I had driven her to physical therapy in Midtown 3 times a week, and I had held her hand when the steroids made her face puffy and she cried because the kids at school looked at her differently. And I had never once, not for a single second, let her see me break. So when Vivian stood up at the head of that table, draped in a Valentino gown the color of champagne, diamonds at her throat that I knew for a fact her husband Drake hadn't bought her, and pointed one long acrylic fingernail directly at my child and said, "We all know she's faking," something inside me went so cold and so quiet that I scared myself. And then Reese's cousin Brayden, Vivian's 19-year-old son, 6'2", 200 pounds, a boy who had been handed every single thing he'd ever touched, pushed back from his chair, walked over to my daughter's wheelchair with a grin on his face like this was the funniest thing that had ever happened, and yanked it out from under her. Reese hit the floor. She didn't cry out. That's the part that broke me. She didn't scream or sob or beg. She just looked up from the marble with those dark eyes of hers, and she was so dignified. My 12-year-old was more dignified in that moment than every adult in that room. And she looked at me, and the look on her face said, "Mom, handle this." I stood up from my chair. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't launch myself across the table at my sister the way every single cell in my body was screaming at me to do. I picked up my phone, I walked out of the dining room and into Vivian's obscenely curated living room with its original Basquiat and its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, and I made one phone call. 5 minutes later, the whole room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't from shock. Let me back up, because you need to understand what kind of family I come from to understand why none of this surprised me. Not really, not deep down. My name is Camille Ardent. I am 38 years old. I grew up in a brownstone in the West Village in New York City with my parents. My father, Theodore Ardent, who built Ardent Capital from a one-room office in 1987 into one of the most quietly powerful private equity firms on the East Coast, and my mother, Sylvia, who was the kind of beautiful that made rooms rearrange themselves. We were raised with the peculiar loneliness of the very wealthy. We had everything except each other. Vivian married Drake Marsh when she was 26. Drake was Atlanta old money, the kind that had been old for so long it had started to smell like something left in a drawer. He was handsome in a forgettable way, the kind of man who got everything he wanted because he'd never once been told no. And when Vivian brought him home to meet our father, Theodore looked at Drake the way he looked at most things, like a balance sheet, and approved the investment. I married later. I married Jonah Vos when I was 30, which in our family's social circle was practically scandal-level late, and I married him because he made me laugh and because he was the first man I'd ever met who was more interested in what I thought than what I looked like. Jonah was a civil rights attorney. He didn't come from money. My mother said at the engagement dinner, in front of Jonah and 4 other people, that she hoped our children would get my bone structure because Jonah's side of the family was, and I quote, built for utility, not aesthetics. I stayed calm. I always stayed calm. It was the thing I was best at. Jonah and I had Reese in New York, moved to Atlanta when she was 4 because Jonah's firm opened a Southeast office, and we both wanted more space and slower seasons and a backyard where our daughter could actually run. We bought a house in Inman Park. Not a mansion, not a statement, just a beautiful old craftsman with a porch and a garden and rooms that felt like they were meant to be lived in. Reese was the most alive person I had ever met in my life. She was electric. She played soccer and violin, and she was writing a fantasy novel on a Google Doc she thought I didn't know about. And she argued with me about everything from climate change to whether cereal counts as soup, and I loved every second of it. She was loud and brilliant, and she had Jonah's laugh, this enormous, unself-conscious laugh that filled up every room she walked into. And then, in April of the year she turned 12, she started tripping. Just tripping over nothing, over flat ground, her foot dragging slightly. She complained her hands felt numb. I took her to the pediatrician, who referred us to a neurologist, who ordered an MRI, and then Jonah and I sat in a beige office in Emory University Hospital while a very kind doctor told us the words that changed the molecular structure of our lives. Multiple sclerosis, pediatric onset. The lesions were on her spine and her optic nerve. I held Jonah's hand so tight I left marks. We didn't tell the extended family right away. We told my parents first, and my mother cried elegantly, and my father immediately started talking about specialists in Zurich, and that was actually helpful in a way, because Theodore Ardent throwing money and logistics at a problem is the closest thing to love he's capable of. We told Vivian 2 weeks later, over a video call. Vivian said, "Oh my God, that's so hard. What does this mean for your lifestyle?" I heard what she was actually asking. She was asking whether Reese's illness was going to become her problem, whether it was going to redirect attention and resources and sympathy that Vivian considered at her core rightfully hers. I told her it meant Reese would need support and understanding, and for the people around her to not make a big deal out of the wheelchair, which she had just started needing in October because a bad flare had temporarily worsened her mobility. "Of course," Vivian said, "we'll be so sensitive." I should have known then. I should have listened to that particular register of my sister's voice, smooth and warm and completely hollow, and I should have made an excuse for Christmas. But my father called me the week before and said, "Camille, come, it matters to me." And Theodore Ardent almost never said things like that. So Jonah and I packed up the car with presents and Reese's medications and her chair and her cooling vest because holiday heating systems wreck her temperature regulation, and we drove across town to my sister's house, where Drake stood at the door in a blazer that cost more than most people's car payments and shook Jonah's hand in that particular way he had, too firm, too long, designed to establish hierarchy, and everything started. The first hour was fine. The way the first hour of everything in our family is always fine, because Vivian runs a social event the way a general runs a campaign. Everything is beautiful. The food is beautiful. The flowers are beautiful. The children are dressed beautifully. Reese sat at the table and was charming and funny and talked to Drake's elderly mother about her fantasy novel, and the old woman was delighted. And I thought, maybe this time. I noticed things, though. The way Braden kept glancing at Reese's wheelchair with that smirk. The way Vivian's best friend, Odessa Pruitt, 40, Buckhead royalty, the kind of woman who has had so much work done that her face has achieved a state of permanent mild surprise, kept whispering to Vivian and cutting looks in my daughter's direction. The way Drake, 3 bourbons in, said something to Jonah about not being able to imagine the medical bills in a tone that was not sympathetic. And I noticed something else, something I had been noticing for 2 years, but had been carefully filing away, saving, cataloging the way my father had always taught me to manage assets, patiently, without emotion, with a long-term strategy. I had an attorney, a very quiet, very specific kind of attorney in Midtown Atlanta named Marcus Webb, who once described himself as someone who untangles complicated family situations with precision and discretion. I had not called Marcus Webb yet. Not until Christmas dinner. Here is what I remember about the 2 minutes after Reese hit the floor. I remember Jonah's chair scraping back so fast it fell over. I remember him on his knees next to Reese before I had even fully processed what had happened. I remember one of Drake's cousins making an uncomfortable sound, half laugh, half gasp. I remember Vivian sitting back down in her chair, and I remembered this very clearly. She picked up her fork. She picked up her fork and she took a bite of her food while my daughter was on her floor. Brayden was still laughing. He had one hand on the wheelchair and he was saying, "Come on, cuz, it's a joke. Just stand up." And Jonah looked up at him with an expression I had never seen on my husband's face before, not in 12 years of marriage, and said, very quietly, "Put that chair down right now." Brayden looked at Drake. Drake looked at his bourbon. Brayden put the chair down. Jonah helped Reese back into it. She was shaking slightly, not from weakness, I realized, but from the effort of not crying. She was holding it together with everything she had. I put my hand on her shoulder. I looked at her and I said, very low, "I've got you. I have always got you. Give me 5 minutes." And then I walked into the living room and I called Marcus Webb. He answered on the second ring, because Marcus Webb answers on the second ring. It was Christmas Day. He answered anyway. That's the kind of attorney Marcus Webb is. I said, "Marcus, it's Camille Ardent. I need you to move on the estate matter, tonight if possible. I also need you to be available next week for a secondary situation." He said, "I've been ready when you are." I said, "I'm ready." I hung up. I stood in my sister's living room for exactly 30 seconds, looking at a Basquiat painting that had been hanging there for 4 years. And I thought about the first time I'd seen that painting in a gallery in Chelsea, and how Vivian had maneuvered to buy it specifically because she'd overheard me tell Jonah I loved it. I had never said anything about that. I had filed it. Then I walked back into the dining room. I sat down in my chair. I picked up my wine glass. I looked at my sister across the length of her perfectly set Christmas table, and I said, in a voice that was so calm it was its own kind of weapon, "Vivian, I think it's time we talked about the estate." The room shifted. Drake looked up. Vivian's perfectly threaded brows contracted by approximately 2 millimeters. Odessa went very still. "This isn't the place," Vivian said. "No," I agreed, "but it is the time." I smiled at her. I had learned that smile from our father. Theodore Ardent smiled like that when he was about to reduce something to its component parts. I spoke to Marcus Webb this morning. A small lie, but directionally accurate. Dad asked him to do a full audit of the trust distributions from the last 3 fiscal years. It's going to be thorough. Vivian's hand tightened on her fork. "Dad wouldn't—" "Dad asked me," I said, 2 weeks ago. He's been troubled by some inconsistencies. He couldn't quite identify them himself, but you know how he is. He senses things even when the details are hazy. This was true. My father had said to me, over the phone, "Camille, something feels off with the numbers. I can't pin it down." And I had told him I would look into it. I had been waiting for the right moment to act. The right moment, it turned out, was now. "I think," I continued, addressing the table at large, because I wanted witnesses. I wanted every one of the 43 people in that room to hear what I was about to say. "That there are going to be some significant conversations in January, some structural changes. I want to make sure everyone is prepared." Then I looked at Drake. "Drake," I said, "I'd love to catch up sometime next week. I have some things I think you'd find very relevant to your personal financial planning." Drake Marsh was not a stupid man. He was not a good man, but he was not stupid, and he heard exactly what I was not saying. His face went a color I can only describe as the particular gray of old concrete. Odessa excused herself from the table 2 minutes later. She did not come back. The next 4 weeks were the quietest kind of chaos. Marcus Webb filed a formal petition for a trust accounting review on December 27th. My father, coached gently and thoroughly by me during 3 separate phone calls, signed the authorization without hesitation. Theodore Ardent had built his entire professional life on precision and accountability, And the idea that his own estate was being managed carelessly, let alone manipulatively, cut through even the fog of his illness like something sharp and bright. The numbers were not good for Vivian. Over 38 months, she had authorized distributions to herself that exceeded her trustee compensation by $417,000. She had structured it carefully, incremental, always within plausible deniability, always with some justification attached. A management fee, an administrative expense, a professional services reimbursement. But Marcus Webb's forensic accountant, a small, precise woman named Dr. Priya Ramachandran, who spoke in declarative sentences and had absolutely no patience for euphemism, laid it out in a 40-page report that used the word improper 11 times and the phrase breach of fiduciary duty 4. Vivian's attorney, a very expensive man named Sterling Cox, who had offices in Buckhead and a reputation for making problems disappear, tried to negotiate. He called Marcus 3 times in the first week of January. Marcus returned none of those calls personally. His paralegal did. The secondary situation took a few more days. I had a conversation with Drake on January 3rd. We met, at his request, at a restaurant in Buckhead, the kind of place where every table has a privacy screen and the staff are trained to appear invisible. Drake came in already sweating slightly, which told me he'd been thinking about what I'd said at Christmas dinner for 8 days straight. He ordered bourbon. I ordered water. I put a manila envelope on the table between us. I did not open it, I just put it there. "I don't want to have this conversation," I said. "I don't want any part of this. But my daughter is 12 years old, and she has a degenerative neurological disease. And on Christmas Day, in your house, she was pulled out of her wheelchair and laughed at, and then your wife sat down and ate her dinner. So, here we are." Drake looked at the envelope. "What do you want?" he said. "I want Braden to understand what he did. I want a real apology delivered to Reese in person without any of the usual Callaway Marsh performance around it. I want it to be genuine, and I will know if it isn't, because I have known liars my entire life, and I am extremely good at reading them." "And the envelope?" "The envelope," I said, "is between you and Vivian. I have nothing to do with your marriage. I am not interested in your marriage. But if Vivian decides that the estate situation somehow becomes my fault, or that this is a war she wants to fight, then the envelope becomes relevant to her, and she'll understand why." He drank half his bourbon in one swallow. "You've been holding this," he said. It wasn't a question. "I hold a lot of things," I said. "I'm very patient." I picked up my water, took one sip, and stood up. "Drake, get your son to my daughter. Make it real. And then figure out your marriage on your own time." I left the envelope on the table. I walked out into the January afternoon, and I sat in my car and I let myself shake for approximately 3 minutes, because I am human, and what I had just done was not natural to me. I am not a person who does these things. I am a person who keeps the peace and absorbs the damage and moves on. And then I stopped shaking, and I drove to Reese's physical therapy appointment, and I sat in the waiting room reading a magazine about kitchen renovations, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. Braden came to our house on January 9th. He came alone. No Drake, no Vivian. I had made that a condition. He rang the doorbell at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and when I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He had his mother's bone structure and his father's height, but standing on my porch without any of the social infrastructure he normally hid inside, he looked young. He looked like what he actually was, a 19-year-old boy who had been raised to think cruelty was a kind of humor and now was standing at the door of a consequence. "Is Reese home?" he said. "Yes, she is. Can I—" He stopped. Started again. I practiced what I was going to say. It sounds stupid now. "It's okay to sound stupid," I said. "Come in." I brought him to the living room and went and got Reese from her room, where she was working on her novel with her headphones on and her cooling blanket over her lap. And I said, "Brayden is here. You don't have to see him. You don't have to do anything. But he came to apologize, and I think he means it, and I'll be right here." She looked at me for a long moment. Does he know why it was bad? Like, does he actually understand? Or is he just sorry he got in trouble? God, I loved this kid. "Why don't you ask him?" I said. She came out to the living room in her chair and she looked at Brayden with this absolutely level gaze that she had definitely inherited from my father. And she said, "Do you know why what you did was bad?" Brayden sat forward on the couch. He had his hands laced together and he was looking at them while she spoke. And then he looked up and he said, "Because you weren't pretending, and even if you were, which you weren't, it would have still been wrong to do that, because your chair isn't like, it's not a prop. It's part of how you're able to be in the room, and I took that away as a joke, and you fell." Reese was quiet for a second. "Yeah," she said, "that's basically it." "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm genuinely sorry. I know that probably doesn't mean a lot coming from me, but..." "It means something," Reese said. "It doesn't fix it, but it means something." After he left, Reese went back to her room without saying anything. I found her 20 minutes later at her desk with her headphones off, just sitting there looking out the window at the January garden. "You okay?" I said. "Did you do something?" she said. "To make him come?" "I had a conversation with his father." She turned to look at me. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind I'm very good at," I said. She almost smiled. "Mom?" "Yeah?" "You're kind of scary sometimes." "Only when I need to be," I said. "You're my person, Reese. There is nothing on this earth I won't do for you." She reached out and took my hand. We sat there together while the winter light came through the window and lay across the floor in long gold bars, and I thought about how this moment was worth everything. Every file I'd kept, everything I'd absorbed, every time I'd been calm when I wanted to scream, all of it, worth it. The estate audit concluded in late February. The final tally, once Dr. Ramachandran had completed her analysis, was $462,000 in unauthorized distributions. Marcus Webb presented Vivian with two options: a full repayment schedule negotiated privately with my father's consent, or a formal legal proceeding. Vivian called me the night she got the letter. I almost didn't answer. I sat there for 4 rings watching her name on my screen, and then I picked up. "You did this," she said. "Dad asked for an audit. I facilitated it. You've been building this for years. You've been waiting." "Vivian," I took a breath. "I've been watching. There's a difference. I didn't do anything until you pulled the wheelchair away from my sick child on Christmas Day. I want you to understand that clearly. I was prepared to go my entire life not acting on any of it, but you made a choice." Silence. "She is 12 years old," I said. "She is 12 years old and she has MS, and she is the bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. And you sat there and watched your son take her chair, and you picked up your fork." More silence. "I don't know what happened to you," I said, and I meant it. I was not performing this part. This part was real. "I don't know when you became this person. You weren't always. I remember when you weren't. But whatever it is, Vivian, whatever twisted thing happened in you, it ends now. Not because I'm punishing you, because I'm done absorbing it. I'm done being the one who stays quiet so you get to stay comfortable." She hung up. She called back 11 minutes later. "I'll do the repayment schedule," she said. "Good," I said. "And Drake is between you and Drake," I said. "I told you that. I have nothing to do with your marriage." Another silence, longer. "Is it bad?" she finally said, and her voice had changed. The performance had dropped out of it entirely, and underneath was something I hadn't heard in 20 years. She sounded like my sister. She sounded like the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms when we were small, before the competition calcified between us. I don't know, I honestly said. That's your territory, not mine. But Vivian, you deserve to know the truth about your own life, whatever you do with it. She was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up again. Then she said, "She's really not faking?" "No," I said. "She is not." "I know." A pause. "I knew then. I don't know why I said it." "I know why," I said. "Because she was getting attention and sympathy and care, and that's always been something you couldn't stand watching other people get. It's been that way your whole life, and I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because at some point you have to look at it." The line was quiet for a very long time. Is Reese okay?" Vivian said finally. "Like, is she managing?" "She is fighting every day," I said, "and she is winning." "She's tough," Vivian said. "She always has been, even when she was little." "She gets it from her father," I said, "and maybe a little from me." I thought I heard, very faintly, a sound on the other end of the line that might have been a small laugh, or might have been the beginning of a cry. I couldn't tell. "I'll have Sterling send the repayment agreement to Marcus," Vivian said. "Okay," I said. "Camille?" "Yeah." She stopped, started. "I'm sorry. About Reese, and about you. About everything." I sat with that for a moment. I let it land. I didn't dismiss it, and I didn't magnify it, and I didn't use it as an opportunity for anything. I just let it be what it was. Imperfect, probably incomplete, a beginning rather than a resolution. And I said, "I hear you." And that was enough. For now, that was enough. March came in cold and bright, and Reese had a good month. Her neurologist at Emory was pleased with her latest MRI. No new lesions, the existing one stable. She started a new medication in February that was managing the fatigue better, and on a Thursday in early March, she came home from school and told me she had tried out for the spring musical. Not in a wheelchair part, not in any accommodation. She had auditioned for the role of narrator, and she had gotten it, and she stood in the kitchen with her backpack still on her back and her face lit up like she was powered by something internal and enormous, and I said, "Reese, baby, that is incredible." And she said, "I know," with this absolutely shameless confidence that made me want to cry from pure joy. Jonah took us to dinner to celebrate, the three of us at this Italian place in Inman Park where we'd been going since Reese was 5, where the owner knows our names and always brings her extra bread because she once told him at age 7 that his bread was better than all other bread. And we sat there for 3 hours eating pasta and talking about nothing important and everything that mattered, and Jonah kept reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. On the walk home, we always walked home from that restaurant. It was maybe 8 blocks, and Reese liked the night air. Reese was in her chair, and Jonah was pushing her, and she was talking about the musical, about her character, about how she wanted to do the narrator's opening monologue in a specific way she'd been thinking about. And the Atlanta night was cold and smelled like coming spring, and the street lights were making gold circles on the sidewalk, and I walked beside my husband and my daughter, and I thought, This right here, this is the whole thing. This is everything I protected. There is a version of this story where I tell you that I did what I did because I am powerful or strategic, or because I'm the kind of woman who plays 5 moves ahead. And maybe part of that is true. I come from Theodore Ardent's blood, and I learned his patience and his precision whether I wanted to or not. But the real reason, the true reason, the one I am certain of, is simpler than that. My daughter was on the floor. My daughter was on the floor, and her face said, "Handle this." And I had been handling things quietly and invisibly and without credit my entire adult life, absorbing every slight and every manipulation and every moment of casual cruelty that my family had seasoned their love with. And on that specific day, at that specific moment, I decided I was done absorbing. I decided to direct. My father came to Atlanta in April. He came with his nurse, a steady and unflappable woman named Constance, who had been with him for a year and who I liked immediately because she looked at Theodore Ardent with exactly the right combination of respect and pragmatism. And he moved more slowly now, and his left hand trembled, but his eyes were the same, sharp and dark, and reading everything in the room the moment he walked in. We had dinner at my house. Jonah cooked. Reese sat next to her grandfather and they talked for an hour about her fantasy novel, about which Theodore had apparently strong opinions. The world building is inconsistent in the second act, he told her, gravely, having asked her to send the first 70 pages, which she had done, and he had read, because Theodore Arden takes everything seriously. After dinner, after Reese had gone to her room and Jonah had tactfully disappeared to give us space, my father and I sat on the porch with decaf coffee and the spring night all around us, and he said, "You handled the estate situation well." "I needed to handle it," I said. "It did." He looked at his coffee cup. "I should have been paying closer attention. You've been dealing with your health." "That's not an excuse I'm comfortable with," he said, and this was so quintessentially Theodore that I felt a rush of something that was half frustration and half love. "How's Vivian?" "Working through it," I said. "Her and Drake are in couples therapy, apparently. I don't know what the prognosis is. I'm not involved." "No," he said, "you wouldn't be." He looked out at the garden, at the tulips Reese and I had planted in October that were now coming up in disorderly, cheerful rows along the fence. My father had never been a garden person. He looked at the tulips the way he looked at most things he didn't understand, with a kind of careful, respectful attention. He said, "I wasn't a very good father." I looked at him. "I was present and I was reliable, and I provided everything material, but I wasn't warm. I didn't know how to be warm. My father wasn't warm, and I thought that was what fathers were. Dad, let me say it." He turned to look at me, and his face in the porch light was older than I ever let myself register, the Parkinson's having done something to the quality of his stillness, making it uncertain where it had always been controlled. "You became what you became in spite of me as much as because of me. You're warm and you're strategic. I gave you the strategic. Sylvia, your mother, she wasn't warm, really. You got that somewhere else." "I got it from wanting to give Reese what I didn't have," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That's how it works, I suppose. Each generation correcting the previous one's mistakes." "Or trying to," I said. "Or trying to," he agreed. We sat quietly for a while. The spring peepers were going out beyond the fence, that small, urgent chorus they make in April, and somewhere a block over, a dog was barking, and the tulips moved slightly in a warm breeze. "She's remarkable," my father said. "Reese, she's quite remarkable." "She is," I said. "She has your spine." "She has her own spine," I said. "Better than mine." He almost smiled. "You did good, Camille." I had been waiting 38 years to hear my father say something like that. I'd stopped waiting maybe 5 years ago, had made my peace with the absence of it, had decided I didn't need it to know my own value. And then he said it on an April porch in Inman Park, and it turned out I hadn't entirely stopped needing it after all. I reached over and I put my hand over his trembling one, and I held it there. And he let me. The spring musical was on May 12th. I sat in the front row with Jonah on one side and my father, who had flown back specifically, who had rearranged 2 months of medical appointments for this, on the other. The auditorium smelled like the particular combination of anxiety and ambition that all middle school performances smell like, and the lights went down and the chatter quieted, and the stage was dark. And then a single spotlight came up, stage center. Reese rolled out in her wheelchair. She was wearing a black dress and her hair was down, and she had this expression on her face that I had been seeing since she was 3 years old, the expression of someone who was completely, entirely in their element, who was exactly where they are supposed to be. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. I counted them. Then she looked directly at the audience, not at the back wall the way nervous narrators do, but at the audience, at the people, seeing them. And she said, in a voice that was clear and full and utterly her own, "Every story begins somewhere. This one begins in the middle, because that's where most of the real ones do." I didn't cry then. I held it together through her entire opening monologue, through all 3 acts, through the curtain call, through the moment when the spotlight found her again at the very end and she sat in the center of that stage, 12 years old and lit up from the inside, and the whole room gave her a standing ovation that went on for 35 seconds. I counted those, too. I didn't cry until afterward, in the hallway outside the auditorium, when Reese came rolling out of the backstage door and saw me and Jonah and her grandfather waiting, and her face broke into that enormous laugh she'd inherited from her father, that laugh that fills up rooms, that laugh that is entirely and specifically and irreplaceably hers. And she said, "Did you guys see the guy in the 3rd row who was crying during my monologue? He was sobbing. It was amazing." That's when I cried. Happy, full, entirely unashamed. "Yeah, baby," I said, pulling her into a hug that she leaned into with her whole self. It was amazing. Here is the thing about revenge that they don't tell you in movies. The version they sell you is loud. It's grand gestures and dramatic confrontations, and someone saying something devastating that the other person can never recover from. It's fire. Real revenge is quieter. It's a folder on a laptop and a lawyer's phone number, and patience. The kind of patience that comes from not coldness, but from knowing exactly what you love and exactly what you will not allow to be destroyed. Real revenge is making one phone call. Real revenge is watching the room go silent and knowing you did that, knowing that every single careful, invisible, uncelebrated thing you did over years of paying attention and holding your tongue and watching and waiting all converged into this one moment where you simply acted. And then it's going home. It's driving home through the Atlanta night to your Craftsman house in Inman Park and sitting on the edge of your daughter's bed and watching her sleep, her face completely smooth and completely peaceful, her breathing steady, her wheelchair folded up neat against the wall. It's knowing she's safe. That's the whole point. That was always the whole point. My name is Camille Ardent. I am 38 years old. I grew up learning to absorb things. And then I grew up learning not to. My daughter got back up. So did I.